Hi everyone, I'm Wendy Muse, creator of the Left Pocket Project, a platform that brings you the history of leftists of color one swipe at a time. And this is the Left Pocket Project podcast. Before I start, I wanted to read a few nice things people are saying about the podcast. For example, someone included the Left Pocket Project podcast as one of, quote, some leftist podcasts you should listen to, alongside some of my fellow podcast comrades in arms. Another person called episode 10 of the Left Pocket Project podcast on leftist student movements in Ethiopia great, while another listener noted that the episode, quote, blew her away. Someone commented on the project as a whole, saying that the Left Pocket Project was, quote, one of the coolest things I've come across in a while, an online effort to recenter people of color and blackness in leftist discourse and social movements. Looking forward to it unfolding. Another listener noted, I supported Left Pocket Project on Patreon. It's good, fam. Which reminds me, you can show your support by going to patreon.com/leftpoc and donating $1 or more a month to show your appreciation and to help keep the show afloat. And on that note, on with the show. For today's episode, I'll be speaking with Seattle-based writer, historian, and filmmaker Shaun Scott. Shaun's work has appeared in Jacobin Magazine, Sports Illustrated, and the film journal Senses of Cinema. He is the author of the 2015 ebook, Something Better, Millennials and Capitalism at the Movies. He's also a writer for City Arts Magazine, where he has a bi-weekly column about popular culture and late capitalism called Faded Signs. Shaun has also just released a book entitled Millennials and the Movements That Made Us, a cultural history of the U.S. from 1982 to the present, which we discuss in depth here as well as much more. So today I am speaking with Shaun Scott. Shaun, thank you so much for being with me.
Hello. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. So you recently wrote a book, and I'm going to ask you a few questions about that. I want you to definitely introduce the book, let us know what it's all about. And I have a few things that I'd like to go over that are very specific from the book. But first things first, I heard of you for the first time actually on Delete Your Account a few weeks ago, or maybe even a week ago. And you were talking about some of the issues that you've noticed on the left and the progressive left, more so than what we normally see in the news as the left, or in other words, the Democrats, right? You pushed us a little bit further than that. But you were talking about some of the issues regarding race, identity, branding, and the like, that you covered in an article that you wrote recently in defense of Callout culture, it's called, for City Arts. So I wanted to just start by talking to you a bit about that article and some of the arguments that you make. And then I wanted to transition into you actually introducing the book and telling us a little bit more about the book, which is coming out today as we're recording this, which is Friday. So first of all, if you could just introduce the article to us and what your primary thesis and arguments are within it, and where do you think they fit in terms of looking at the left as it moves forward?
Right. So first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I'm glad you made it through that Delete Your Account episode. It was really, really fun to record. So the In Defense of Callout Culture was written sort of in response to, fortuitously, I think like 3 or 4 writers in a span of like 9 days in late January, or at some point in January, had all sort of taken turns describing and really criticizing what they saw to be a problematic cultural tendency on the left, right? Meagan was a very knowledgeable writer who's written for Jacobin, or writes for Jacobin, in an article about sort of millennial perfectionism, talked about Callout culture as a way of reinforcing a sort of cultural panopticon where people feel like they're unable to slip up or make a mistake, and that there are sort of digital hordes waiting to capitalize on you and call you out for being a racist or a sexist of some kind. And Meagan's thesis, I think, was that this was having an adverse effect on the mental health of many people who are on social networking. Katie Herzog, who's a writer here in Seattle, where I'm based, for The Stranger, wrote a piece that really took on the problem, as she saw it, of call-out culture head on, and really framed it as something that was stifling dissent and disagreement among the American left, broadly defined. And there's another piece that I'm having a hard time registering. Oh, Amber Ailey Frost wrote another piece that sort of mentioned it tangentially, or at least touched on an article that was pretty formative in a lot of these criticisms of call-out culture, Mark Fisher's Exiting the Vampire Castle. And so I sat back and watched, after the first one, I was like, okay, I see that that's been said. Then the second one comes out, and it's like, I'm starting to feel a type of way about this. And by the time I read the third one, I think that's where the urge to push back really, really came. And so in defense of call-out culture, which is what I wrote, partially to sort of summarize a lot of these arguments that the other three writers had relayed, but then also to try to contextualize this broader discussion about call-out culture and to situate that in a broader history of the American left post-1968, saying that we've actually been in a situation before where people who we thought of as leftists criticized people who were a little bit further left or who were maybe on the identitarian left, groups like the Black Panthers, maybe more radical groups like the Weather Underground. And many of those people fled the coalition that had really been the governing consensus in the post-World War II period. It's the way that you get sort of a very vivid neoconservative movement of people who had been formally who had formally marched with Dr. King and been champions of civil rights struggles. Very, very suddenly, by the time we get to, say, the middle 1970s, sort of joining into Richard Nixon's appeals to the silent majorities, ways of stigmatizing sort of the long-haired radicals on college campuses, and just a general sense, or a general sort of defection, I think, of white American leftists, or former leftists in particular, who were sort of not able to stand the heat, if you will, of a fomenting anti-war movement, a fomenting civil rights movement that was suddenly more preoccupied with questions of poverty and redistribution than it was with formal civil rights discourse. And it seemed to me that a lot of the writers, maybe without knowing it, some maybe while knowing it, who were talking about call-out culture and saying that, the identitarian left and people of color on the left are maybe a little bit too sensitive, going a little bit too far in calling out racism, maybe in calling out sexism, calling out ableism. And I think it's important to realize that the left has struggled historically to hold on to all the tools that it has needed to hold the most privileged members of the left accountable. And that it seemed to me that a lot of these articles that were sort of being rehashed in these arguments about call-out culture were really functions, knowingly or not, of a certain reactionary tendency that we've seen turn into neoconservatism before.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting because when I had seen, similarly to you, I saw all these articles popping up, and I recall listening to other podcasts and reading other texts related to it. There were lots of people who were sort of positioning themselves as like acolytes of Mark Fisher, which is interesting. And I think in ways that, like, I personally don't have any gripes about Mark Fisher, but it became, it sort of, everyone was coalescing around this one article and sort of turning it into the new Bible of the new left, right? And
right.
I think there were certain aspects of that piece that are certainly worth keeping in mind and that are very salient, and especially in pushing us to consider that sometimes things do go too far. But at the same time, if this becomes the end-all be-all of the discussion about what the left should look like and how it should be inclusive on its face, right, then that poses several problems. But I appreciate that you went into it and you really sort of broke down some of not only the problems with his article so much, but more the problem in the response and the use of the piece and the ideology within the piece, expressed within the piece, to sort of silence other parts of the left. But on that note, what's interesting about your book is that you actually open with one such person who's very active in calling out certain problems on the left, and that person is Marissa Johnson. So your book, which just came out today, Friday the 23rd, is called Millennials and the Moments That Made Us. And I wanted you to talk about that, of course. We're going to talk about it for the rest of this podcast. But
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really interesting that you chose to open with Marissa Johnson, someone who is rather polemic to some degree for some people on the left. And I think particularly, during election 2016, for those of you who may not know who she is by name, she was one of the protesters who went up on stage during Bernie Sanders' speech in Seattle. And if I'm not mistaken, that speech in Seattle was about Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid.
Right.
So when I saw it happening, I said, and I was out of the country and I saw this, and there were aspects of it that were left out, context that was left out. But upon first viewing, I said, it's kind of odd to me that we are focusing so much on Black death that we're not talking about what it means and what it takes to sustain Black life. And by that, I mean, for example, there are people who are lower income, who are Black. There are elderly people, there are disabled people who are Black, who depend on things like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid to survive. And so my question is, how do we fit this form of call out, which I think is valid, within a larger question about what the needs of especially lower income people of color happen to be? And then finally, why did you choose her? And I'm fascinated about this because, as I said, she can kind of be... as much as I respect her too, I think for some she sort of triggers a certain response. And I'd be curious as to why you had her write your foreword.
Yeah, it's honestly in all the interviews that I've done, maybe the dozen or so interviews that I've done about this book, people that I've talked to about it, it's really a question that for whatever reason, wink, wink, doesn't come up as often as I thought it would. And I know Marissa because we're both based here locally. I was actually there that day when she interrupted Bernie Sanders. And I think something that she had said when I talked to her about that protest and the aftermath of it that has always sort of resonated with me in a general way, that she sort of put forward the actions that she took to put Black lives to the center of a discussion where they might not necessarily have been. Is that if you can't carve out the space to do this and to center Black life on the left, we really have no shot in this American project anyway, because this is the ideological orientation that is supposed to be the most responsive, the most receptive, and the most and on the cutting edge, ideologically, politically, however else, of sticking up for vulnerable populations that have been historically disadvantaged by capitalism. Mm-hmm. So that if you're a member of the left, broadly defined, right, and the left is a factional sort of big tent term that people use to include everyone from Hillary Clinton to Angela Davis, and as big as that tent is, if in this camp, in a democratic socialist setting where people are turning out on a hot Seattle sunny day in August in 2015 to turn out to hear a democratic socialist speak on behalf of and in advocacy of vulnerable populations under capitalism, if in this place the centering of Black life is going to be met with hostility, then we have to be asking ourselves some really fundamental questions about what it is that we're trying to do. And so ultimately, I think I went and I read, Bernie Sanders' Our Revolution book and saw where he mentioned speaking in Seattle, but didn't mention getting cut off by Marissa. I think it's important to me to bring those questions to the forefront. And people who think of themselves as very cosmopolitan on the left, I think you sort of get the sense of where the extent or limits of people's radicalism really is when you bring out somebody who's holding down a very, very clear ideological and self-presentational sort of gambit that puts Black women at the center, puts women of color in specific at the center of political claims. And that's kind of a litmus test for where the rest of the left camp needs to go. I think it's also sort of this question of we've seen so many dog whistles from Black politicians, Black intellectuals, Black authors who make use of all the social and intellectual capital of affiliating with the Black freedom struggle, but with the other side of their mouths sort of let you know that they're not really actually going to be there for you when the temperature turns up a little bit too high. Mm-hmm. Or from white progressives who sort of let you know that they might go on Arsenio Hall and play the saxophone, but when it comes down to it, they're going to announce the crime bill at Stone Mountain, Georgia, a Ku Klux Klan stalwart. Mm-hmm. And so those symbols matter. So for me, it was important to get Black people on the cover of my book. It was important to get a book that looked like it was designed after a Black Lives Matter sweatshirt, to have a Black author be the foreword for the book, so that even if sort of the general Black Socialist project is the launching pad and the rest of the book goes out of it, we know what the grounding or the basis for this is, just based on some of sort of those early symbols that you get introduced to, and also as a result of Marissa's reputation and her strength as a writer in the introduction.
Right. And it really is a beautifully written preface here. One of the things that she says that really stuck with me, and I'm going to skip around a bit in terms of the quotations, but she notes at one point, "Nothing is as we thought it was or as it should be," and later says that the realities of my life contradict the ideals and aspirations that I was taught as a child. Not only was I steeped in the propaganda of meritocracy against the background of worldly circumstances that proved otherwise, but then she goes on to explain, her interracial family was seen as a symbol of progress, but at the same time, she was noting all of these things that were still behind. So in a lot of ways, her introduction is very much a quintessential packaging of what is happening for many millennials, which is we have a lot of hope, and I think we were raised to have a lot of hope. And you talk about some of those socio-historical underpinnings, which we'll get to in a minute. But we're raised with this sense of hope, but at the same time, we're met with so many disappointments, just based on the sort of economic issues that we're facing, racial issues that we're continuing to face. And I think it's a really sort of splash of cold water on our faces that, what we're taught in school, what we're taught in our own families isn't quite the way things work out in the end. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good way of sort of setting up your argument and what you go on to say. So Speaking of your book, let's get into the meat and potatoes of it all. Can you tell the audience a little bit about first of all, what made you write this book? And then secondly, just sort of what the basic premise of the book is.
Yeah. So this book, I want to say creative sort of nervous system for it was formed in late 2014, which many of us are going to remember, I think historically, as sort of the time where we watched on television as Mike Brown's killer went unprosecuted. The killer of Eric Garner, similarly exonerated of all charges. It was a period in time where the GOP was sort of cementing what eventually became its successful presidential run 2 years later. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I personally turned 30. And so it was a pretty, very, very heady, sort of momentous time. And for me, I think it was the experience of watching, in specific, the experience of watching, I think it was a football game where the St. Louis Rams were playing. Maybe it was Baltimore, maybe it was New Orleans. But in any case, St. Louis was playing. They were on the road. At the same time that they're sort of, switching over to CNN to look at whether or not protesters in Ferguson, the outskirts of St. Louis, were going to burn the city to the ground. Mm-hmm. And just this sort of high-low experience of, on the one hand, American entertainment and the Rams playing on a Monday, or maybe it was a Thursday night, I know it was in the middle of the week, representing the city on the road, and then back at home, a situation that was so obviously an outgrowth of caste prejudice and the American caste system of race. I think for me, that was where the creative nervous system of the book was sort of formed, and that I thought that if I could find a way to mix sort of that extremely ephemeral and ultimately trivial sort of sports spectacle with the tremendous weight of the actual realities of a place like St. Louis in this late capitalist context, that somewhere in that vertigo and in that creative tension, I'd be able to spin out something that was at least an entertaining read. As I sort of started to peel back the layers on sort of started to do a little bit more deep internal work on what my motivations were as a writer and what personal well would I be drawing on, to have a compelling narrative in this book and not just something that was creatively interesting, to me, I sort of fell back on a lot of early experiences that I had as a millennial, someone who was born in 1984. My earliest memories in life are of sitting alone in front of the television, just sort of internalizing a lot of the pop culture that I saw, not quite knowing at that point in time that there was a reason why I was sort of forced to be at home alone by myself in a situation, a neoliberal context where double income households were sort of on the rise. And so it's somewhere in there that I think the book sort of started to come together. Now, the full title of the book, right, Millennials and the Moments That Made Us, A Cultural History of the U.S. from 1982 to the Present, the central argument is basically that over the last 35 or so years, capitalism has sort of undergone a few fundamental core changes that are reflected broadly in the popular culture that we consume, and that a lot of the popular culture serves to reinforce neoliberalism at the same time that some of it suggests ways out of it. So a lot of the book is a reconstruction of the ways that American movies, television shows, books, music, etc., serve to reconstruct and legitimate the capitalist status quo. I think that's very much the story of the first 6 chapters. Mm-hmm. And as we get into the latter 6 chapters, it veers a little bit more into the territory of thinking about ways that popular culture can suggest ways out of, or suggest correctives, or at least suggest ways of becoming more self-aware of that neoliberal context.
Right. I think too, in your first few chapters, one of the things that I was interested in, as nerdy as this sounds, is actually with your playing around and really problematizing some of the definitions of millennials or millennialism, right? You go rather in depth in these first few chapters into how you define millennials. You discuss geographic boundaries as well. So even though this is a discussion primarily of the U.S., you sort of hint towards us that there is an underlying story about international millennialism as well, and something that's perhaps worth pursuing at a later date or in another book. But then
Right.
You also talk about a lot of the socio-historical and economic frameworks that are also being engaged in this process, where you're talking almost entirely about pop culture. So if you could kind of lay out some of the theoretical background as well, that would be great.
Yeah, so millennials is a fraught term. I mean, 60% of people who are designated as millennials don't believe that they are millennials, right? That's kind of just like a quintessential conundrum of our generational condition, in that a lot of us who are part of an age cohort who have experienced a lot of the same things, who have never known of, a kind of capitalism that is not been prone to devastating busts and euphoric highs. We actually don't think that en masse, at least 60% of us don't think that has actually had a collective determination on the worldview of an age cohort. Mm-hmm. And I, as somebody who, if you're a cultural historian, and I think if you're doing something that is that veers on sociology, you're looking everywhere for the kinds of external determinants that might play a role in the way that certain populations behave. And so I try to talk about the ways that millennials, capital M, you can define that in a number of ways. I ultimately decide on 1982 because the guys that coined the term, Neil Howe and William Strauss, and did some of the first writing about millennials as such, that's when they say it started. There was a culture of overprotectionism in regards to American children that started in or about 1982 or afterwards. That was borne out in baby on board signs, that was borne out in a Reaganomic context. Reagan in an era of Reaganomics where big government was not mobilized to do much. One of the few things that it did in the 1980s was try to think about ways to expand Social Security to include children that were born into poverty. We saw a lot of different all sorts of ways that I cover in the first chapter of the book, and that attitudes towards childhood that had not been in place before about 1982 or 83 are suddenly there by the time we get to the end of the decade. Mm-hmm. And we can quibble on the dates, right? Pew Research Center will tell you that it's 1981 to 1997. I think there are a few people that have made arguments about a liminal generation that was actually born between 1977 and 83 called Xennials. Mm. And ultimately, I think all of those things are very, very interesting. But my book is kind of using millennials and generational politics and pop culture as a poison pill to really talk about capitalism. Like that's the thing that I'm fundamentally more interested, that I'm fundamentally interested in discussing, and that it so happens that generational dynamics, to me in this context, are kind of the best, most adequate container to talk about certain transitions that happened in American capitalism from 1945 to 1973 as an era that we can distinguish from the one that took place from, say, 82 or 80 going forward. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, and I make this point in the book, that there are people that might not be millennials, capital M, but there are many populations, older populations, that are living through sort of a millennial condition, lowercase m. And if you're a baby boomer, you're suddenly aging into what it means to suddenly be subject to austerity, the threat of Social Security being run on a for-profit privatized basis, declining social protections. You can age into that millennial condition, but the fact remains that members of the millennial generation, capital M, have never known anything but that.
I think that there's a part in the beginning as well, or sort of towards the beginning, where you talk a lot about the contradictions, the political contradictions that are going on in the years that we're children, basically babies and children, right? Mm-hmm. So you see a lot of this talk about the family and a talk about the necessity of, supporting one another and whatnot. But then you have this really aggressive, as you mentioned, austerity politics, aggressive ways of sort of rethinking masculinity to be hyper aggressive and in a way that sort of alienates women or puts women in a particular place that's not super helpful looking forward. Mm-hmm. You also, I think on that note, you really do a great job of talking about or reframing this political discussion as a discussion of gender, which I thought was really fascinating and a unique approach to talking about this. So obviously we can talk all day about the way masculinity and femininity is rendered, but the way that I think you do a great job of combining politics in there. And especially one of the images that stood out to me the most was when you started talking about foreign policy, and you said that the U.S. itself was sort of being cuckolded, and this is the word you use, being cuckolded by corporations that went elsewhere, and in particular that went to the third world, right? So Republican politicians were sort of framing this discussion in sexual terms in some ways, even if metaphorical, but sort of this process of someone from another country is stealing what's ours, first of all. And then these corporations that they were obviously upholding were also leaving them to go to these places that we had previously, sort of reduced to being threats, to be honest. So.
Yeah. And so the first sort of 6 chapters, I think there's a chapter called American Dad, another called American Mom, and another called American Siblings. And I think those 3 chapters taken together sort of form a lot of the creative nervous system of the first half of the book. And this idea, I mean, we're talking about Mark Fisher earlier, to circle back to this, it's kind of funny because Mark Fisher at an earlier stage for me, and still even today, just his general approach, a huge influence on me. Exiting the Vampire Castle, I think, is something else altogether. But when we get around to talking about a book like Capitalist Realism, pulled quite a lot from that book as far as how to think about changes to capitalism in a symbolic sense. And I think that's where you sort of get this idea of, in the American Dad chapter, thinking about the ways that masculine overcompensation in response to the disloyalty of American corporations and sort of chasing after the private sector as the be-all, end-all of public life, that started to spin out there. I think in the American Mom section, it goes to a different place where we're thinking about the ways that American motherhood was being sort of redefined in a lot of different ways that I think suited the neoliberal project that had a need for women that were going to enter the American workforce and see it as a kind of liberation, even though it was probably going to be working for 65 cents on the dollar. Mm-hmm. And, it comes down to that American Siblings section, right? Talking about the ways that Generation X and Millennials, there's a really complex interplay between those two. And that when you have double income households where parents are forced to do more working for less pay, there's a lot of cultural boogeymen that sort of spring up, and a culture of overprotectionism, overcompensation, fear about drugs and crime, and pornography in American entertainment. And oftentimes Generation X as a block was sort of seen as the problem kid, right, by the American mom and the American dad, like the kid that we corrupted because we were way too permissive in the 70s. And in the 80s, you get this back to basics movement that says, millennials, we're gonna bring this generation up to be really a generation of kids that are going to redeem the mistakes that we thought that we made with Generation X. And I think all of this I try to frame in the book as just basically a diversion from a larger conversation we needed to be having about giving families more resources so that maybe you didn't need to have both parents working, or that maybe we had a paternal leave system, cultural expectations that maybe expected more caregiving from American men, any kind of collective or social question about how to go about the problem of the kid in this neoliberalism context, which was a problem about millennials. Those are sort of pushed to the side, and I think people look much more towards privatized solutions as opposed to political collective ones.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that you mentioned in chapter 5 that sort of stuck with me as well is you have a few lines in there about Gen X, two that stuck out in particular. One, you're really framing the way that the boomers look to Gen X as sort of making money off the glamorization of Gen X's precarity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are all these movies that come out where they're showing millennials living in big cities that are gentrifying and neoliberal sort of conditions, but there's sort of a humor or a lightness, even a revelry in their suffering in some ways.
Right.
But then you go on and you talk about, which is, again, another great example, Lisa Simpson and her relationship with her brother Bart. So you basically create the metaphor in which Lisa is seen as the millennial. She's more responsible. She's sort of putting Bart in his place all the time, and she's the one who's actually doing the work, whereas Bart is just like, skateboarding all day and saying crude things, and his sister's always the one to kind of come around and fix things. And so I think that's a very clear example of what's happening in both the pop cultural and political landscape, at least at this early period, about what millennials are supposed to represent, right?
For sure.
But you go on from chapter 6 further, or I guess after chapter 5. Once you hit chapter 6, you start breaking in. You start entering a little bit of a different space. You talk more about race in these sections. You start talking about more of we pull us more into the present. And if I'm not mistaken, it's around this chapter, around chapter 6, chapter 7, where you start talking about the coming of age period for millennials, where we're starting to, finish high school, go into college. And I think this is really where your strongest work is presented. You start talking about Jay-Z, about September 11th, about the changes even in rap music. So if you could talk a bit about this sort of transitional part of the text, because I think for me, it's what stood out. And perhaps I'm biased because I too am a late millennial. So I was in high school when 9/11 happened, and I recall all of these things with more clarity than perhaps some of the things that were happening when I was a little kid. So if you could talk a bit about this center section and some of the arguments that you present, why hip hop, why sports, what was it about these two particular socio-cultural activities that really stood out to you as emblematic of what millennials were facing?
Right. Well, I mean, hip hop is, I guess just can't kind of say enough about how just as a cultural form, and as well as talking about individual records, like in one way or another, the approach that I sort of like, that creative approach that you see in hip hop, very much based on sampling, hyper political at the same time that it can be extremely flippant. That's passed out of just being a cultural form and into being kind of more of a sensibility that I think has transcended just the records. And I also feel sort of implicated in that cultural approach. And so it was only too fun to be able to sit down and remember what the blueprint as a record of Jay-Z's that came out on 9/11 represented on such a terrible day. I think it's sort of this idea that in American rap music at that point, we're sort of starting to see more of an emphasis on a cultural trend that had been there all along, but I think that had been brought much more to the center, which is sort of the sense of because I survived it, other people should have to survive on their through their own trauma or through their own tragedy as well, right? At some point in time in, I think, 2003 or 2004, you see Kanye talking on Through the Wire about turning tragedy into triumph. Beyonce, who's at this point hip hop adjacent in 1999 or 2000, a song literally called Survivor. And it just so happens that a lot of these narratives are really, really well suited to being sort of a prism for understanding the way that capitalism was going to rebound after 9/11. And that very much an emphasis not on asking the question, why is it that people had to go through such desperate socioeconomic situations anyway? Or why was it that people are sort of put in the situation of having to be survivors? But the glorification of surviving, the act of overcoming, resilience as a cultural trope that I think is the theme that sort of dominates the chapters that run from 7, 8 to 9. And I think that cultural sort of form or that cultural gust has as much to do with just sort of the dynamics of how people of color are disadvantaged under neoliberalism as much as it is the way that neoliberalism itself behaves, which is, as Milton Friedman would tell you, right, if you read the shock doctrine in many speeches that he gave going back as far as the 1970s, the idea of capitalism attaching itself to crisis so that it could then transcend those crises to emerge stronger so that free market reforms could come out more at the forefront of American life after a recession, after a calamity, after a war, is really central to the way that neoliberalism behaves. And so hip hop occupies that really weird space where it's legitimating sort of the cultural values of capitalism at the same time that it's begging a lot of these more uncomfortable questions, right? Jay-Z is a very inside outside figure in maybe sort of the same way that Miles Davis was 40 or 50 years before him, at the same time being very, very comfortable in the home of this broader capitalist project, is all along asking a lot of questions that imply, even if they don't state, a sort of more radical politics. So that's sort of where those chapters from 7, 8 to 9, which were 7 and 9 in particular, I think some of the funnest to write.
I could see
sort
that.
of went. Yeah.
I could feel it when I was reading it because I said, oh, this is where he's really starting to deepen the analysis and bring in some things that I think are really salient and stuck with me visually as well. You know, I had a very strong mental image of what you were talking about in these chapters.
Right.
And I particularly appreciated your breakdown in chapter 7 of the timeline for 9/11. So this is super fascinating. I thought this is a great sort of rhetorical device that you use in the book. What you end up doing is you sort of say, or not sort of, you literally break down the Today Show that was showing on the day of 9/11. So you start with the opening and you talk about, you know, its ratings and the like, and sort of the quotidian drivel that they often dealt with. But the way that you portray it later as you get closer and closer to the attack on the Twin Towers is you're starting to really sort of uncover the neoliberalism that's floating up to the surface, right? And things that just seem sort of innocuous. You know, they're talking about, they have, I believe, Harry Belafonte on as a guest that morning. And he's talking about a particular set of music that he was focusing on for the interview with Katie Couric, if I'm not mistaken. And you have a quotation there where you say, Black music, like the spirituals of the long road to freedom, which is the box set, I believe, or video that he was promoting, and the bombastic raps of Jay-Z's The Blueprint serve neoliberalism. If individuals from historically marginalized groups can rise to the ranks of pop culture prominence, capitalism is able to appear as an inclusive and fair social order that rewards hard work. Blacks who cannot become success stories are stigmatized as somehow personally deficient. And I immediately at that time also thought of, you know, what Michelle Alexander spends a lot of the latter half of her book talking about, which is this idea of Black excellence and sort of how it in and of itself is deceptive in a lot of ways, because we have these two contradicting messages. On the one hand, you have people suffering under deindustrialization, still recovering from the austerity of the 80s and into the 90s. And then you also mentioned, for example, all of the companies like GE that were laying off employees, although GE ironically would become super rich after the war started because they were a contractor for the war. And so you have all of these contradictions of massive success or seeming success on the one hand, people like Oprah Jay-Z, arguably, Obama. And then you have the reality on the other side that is a completely different story. People are suffering, and it's happening at the same time. But only one of those sides tends to be, well, I guess both sides are focused on, but basically one is used as a foil to the other. Why aren't you poor people getting your shit together and making it like the rest of us?
Right. And it's something that W.E.B. Du Bois's birthday is actually today, and so I saw a few sort of clips circulating today on Friday. We're recording this the 23rd of February, and it's something that he actually anticipated as early as the mid 20th century. He was sort of talking about what we now recognize as neoliberal narratives that elevate exceptional people of color who were able to transcend "quote unquote" race prejudice through their individual initiative. Mm-hmm. And as a socialist, he was, pretty blunt in saying that was a counter-revolutionary sort of cultural representation. It didn't help. He was not a fan. But yeah, I mean, I think the 7th chapter, the part where it's sort of going through and talking about the 9/11 timeline, it's like it starts at probably 8 a.m. or something like that, and goes all the way down to the moment that the first tower is hit and through. There was actually a really great book called Television by Raymond Williams, where he sort of talked about one of the things that we don't do enough as cultural critics, and he actually wrote this the year that the towers were put up in 1974, is like this idea of culture or popular culture is sort of a seamless system. Television in particular is a seamless system, kind of a river that you can step into or out of, but that even when you turn the TV off, it's always flowing. And so commercials and the sitcoms and the news and the channel promos, all of those things are part of the cultural programming of that given episode of viewing. You're getting messages that reinforce one another without maybe all the ways of knowing it. And so it was just kind of a gamble creatively in some ways, maybe there's something to this. Maybe if I sit down and watch the Today Show in the hours leading up to, or in the 90 minutes leading up to 9/11, I'm going to find something in here that enforces the ways that people thought about 9/11 afterwards. And within 15 or 20 minutes, it just became really, really clear that I think all the scholars that have been doing research about resilience and about Robin James, I think of in particular, who's written a great book for Zero Books as well. People who have done a lot of critical thinking about the notion of resilience in Naomi Klein's The Shot Doctrine, they were super onto something, because those narratives were everywhere to the point where there's a lot of stuff in that chapter that I had to kind of cut out, but that still kind of made the point,
Yeah. I mean, it's so, I think reflecting back on it, looking at all of this in retrospect, you really feel it and you see it. But I think at the time, because we're living within it, right? It doesn't, as you said, it's almost like this TV in and out where you don't quite, I don't know, it's so pervasive that you don't quite digest what's happening. And then when you can kind of look back at it and you see especially the aftermath and the consequences of this type of thinking and how poorly it works. I mean, it's completely a failure, right? And I think especially now, after a lot of what's gone on, towards the end of the Obama administration, and now we have Trump, I think it really kind of knocks some sense into people, into thinking okay, maybe things weren't as perfect as we thought. Maybe this type of approach to poverty, that we could bootstrap our way out of the situation that we were living through, maybe that doesn't quite add up. And maybe there are problems with that, despite the fact that there are people who look like us on the television screen who are singing its praises, right?
Right.
And speaking of Obama, who I can't leave out, because you do have a chapter or several chapters where you talk about him. But again, some of the latter chapters, you start to really talk about Obama. And again, this bootstrapping comes up in ways that I think for many of us who look to Obama as this hopeful figure, when you sort of look at the underside and you see some of the things that he was saying, again, in retrospect, it all begins to sort of make sense why we're in the predicament that we are today, and still economically. There's a section where you talk about his relationship with Michael Jordan, which is really fascinating. You mentioned that he had actually asked Michael Jordan to help with campaign donations in 2008. But prior to that, he had made a statement. You say here, then Senator Obama had lambasted Black children who spent their money on Air Jordan sneakers instead of books in an ESPN segment from 2002. And again, sort of the the early days of Obama we don't talk about as much, but within your book you show all the contradictions of his politics as well. So on the one hand, you have this kind of, this moment where he's basically taking a jab at poor people. And then in the other parts of the book, you have him sort of calling out some of the austerity measures and the like. So it's this double-sided figure that we can't, I think even in the present, sometimes it's hard for us to fully wrap our heads around. And I think you do a great job of at least laying the groundwork for thinking about that.
Right. I think it's one of those things where I think the nature, the mixed nature of Obama's identity that people talk about, quote unquote mixed, is something that has been sussed through a lot more than the mixed nature, so to speak, of his ideological sort of bent as somebody who, on the one hand, pays as much tribute as he possibly can at every opportunity to civil rights struggles of the past, the symbolic march on Selma that he did in 2015 to commemorate the original march in the civil rights era. Sort of the praise that he has for civil rights athletes like Bill Russell and Fannie Lou Hamer, who he name-checked on the campaign trail in 2008. On the left hand, and then with the right hand, the fact that, the guy taught at the University of Chicago, which was like literally the petri dish for neoliberalism, and absorbed a lot more of those ideas than people give him credit for. I mean, people were trying to call it out in 2008. Like, I don't think you understand that on economic issues, we're not getting what we now think of as sort of the Bernie platform. Like, this is going to be a lot of race-blind, colorblind, rising tide lifts all boats sort of mentality. And when you get to the point where Obama's talking explicitly about how much of a fan of the free market he is in 2008, appoints a guy who eulogized Milton Friedman to his economic cabinet. All of those things, in retrospect, they become a lot clearer that we spent a lot of time focusing on the dual nature of Obama's black and white identity, where I think that that's an important story. I think an undertold story or an underemphasized story is the position that he occupies as somebody who has an intense awareness of civil rights struggle, who listened to Malcolm X phonographs when he was young, patterned his speaking style after him even, and then grew up to really reach the halls of American capitalism and become an exemplar of it, to such an extent that he turned around and said that people who were asking him to prosecute bankers in the aftermath of the Great Recession were wanting him to govern out of anger, and we need to take a cool-headed, more rational approach. I think all of those things, that part of it is, to me anyway, a much more complicated, less told story than sort of the way that we tend to focus more on his identity as the fulcrum of his presidency and his stature as a public figure.
Right. And another less told story that you go into a little bit in your book that I think is really fascinating is one about the place or the role of money as compensation for racial and economic animus. You mentioned in passing, sort of in the same chapter where you're talking about Obama, that while you're working this sort of lowland job, I think you were no longer able to afford college, right? And you were sort of working to make ends meet. And you noted that you felt like the tips that you got were sometimes the attempts by some people who were tipping you to say, well, okay, he's clearly having it rough. Let's give a little tip here and there. It'll help compensate for whatever world problems there are. It's like this moment of charity where we can sort of fix things, right?
Right.
And while we're talking about Obama, I immediately thought of a lot of the dialogue that's been going on around Black Panther. So spoiler alert, I haven't actually seen it, but I've read a lot of the reviews. And if I'm not mistaken, one of the characters, if not Black Panther himself, right, forms an NGO or sort of like helps kids in poor neighborhoods in California at the end of the film. And a lot of people have drawn parallels between the Black Panther character and Obama, particularly within this his attempt to kind of give back, but in a way that's very superficial. And I immediately just thought of some of the things that you talk about here in your own relationship to money and charity at this point in your life. And we could obviously easily extend that to talking about the place of NGOs under neoliberalism. You don't go in a ton about NGOs, but I'd be curious to hear what you think about nonprofit organizations, particularly in Black communities, their connection to neoliberalism, and also perhaps what is your take on reparations, and does reparations fit somewhere in this discussion, as well as perhaps a flawed approach, or at least somewhat flawed approach, one that needs to be deepened to address racial and economic inequality?
I have to say that I guess every person who's an author, every writer, every scholar has a moment that they can sort of look back on when their sort of intellectual awakening or their journey started as a critical thinker. And for me, it was undoubtedly Randall Robinson in the early 2000s came out with a book called The Debt, What America Owes to Blacks. That was a polemic in favor of the concept of reparations. And part of it is the destination, but it's also the way that he sort of in that book went through all the ways in which the American social project has despoiled people of color, African Americans in specific, not just in the course of 246 years of slavery, but also talking about the aftermath of that, Jim Crow in the American South, and then also the impact that segregation, I think, has had on depressing Black wealth accumulation in this capitalist context, for me was incredibly formative. And so I think about the ways that we're sort of at a stage where we're not, our political imagination is such where we don't have much one, right? We're not really encouraged to think much in the direction of what can we do collectively to fix a collective problem that we created as a collective. And instead, a lot of the energy that in a former era, as recently as the mid-20th century, we sort of started to at least get in the direction of thinking about how are we going to, as a state, as a political system, as a set of government directives, how are we going to downwardly redistribute wealth? How are we going to mobilize the power of the state to create jobs? How are we going to create a social safety net that keeps people from sliding too far into poverty? And also, how are we going to create a tax ceiling that prevents American corporations from being able to get ahead at the expense of workers? That framework has really kind of gone the way of the dodo bird at this point. And I think NGOs and nonprofit actors, non-state actors in the form of nonprofits and whatnot have they sort of, at the same time that they address problems created by neoliberalism and may do very, very good work in fixing a few of them, although we could have another conversation about exploitation in the nonprofit sector. They ultimately serve to reaffirm a few basic assumptions about how the state and capital are supposed to behave in regards to its most vulnerable populations, which is they're not, right? We have a general expectation that they're not going to do much. Institutions are broken. Capitalism is a flawed system. And so the best bet that you can really have is to just make as much money as you possibly can. And then when you get around to it, you give back, quote unquote. It's actually something that you sort of see a little bit in kind of the movie. I know we're talking about Obama and sort of the 2000s context, but I first started to notice this in like the movie Ghostbusters, the 1984 one, where it's like, why is this movie putting so much energy into letting us know that the cops can't do anything, the EPA can't do anything, the mayor is hapless? It's like all the institutions are completely bankrupt, and it just is up to what amounts to a kind of scrappy nonprofit team to just sort of put it together for themselves.
Right.
And so at the same time that they're fixing this problem, they're also smart businessmen. It doesn't work for me. I think the failures of that approach are pronounced and at this point pretty well documented, to where if you're somebody who's in the public eye and you're not talking about mustering the political will to do what we need to do as far as taxation is concerned, you're not advocating for workers to organize and struggle on their own behalves. I think we're talking about nibbling around the edges. We need to get pretty serious here about collective solutions.
Right. And I think that there's a big part of your book as well where you talk about the focus of the individual, or focus on the individual under neoliberalism. And in particular, if we think about millennials, there's this fascinating trope that you talk about that comes up as well. So while on the one hand, millennials are demonized. They're shown as lazy and good for nothings, and they're all, going back to their parents' homes. They don't want to work, etc. At the same time, you have another narrative that comes up, and that millennials themselves are writing, saying, no, actually, we're struggling under the economic conditions that you left us. We're working for free half the time. We don't have, stable income. We don't have a safety net. And from that, oddly, in response to these calls for actual assistance and support on a systemic level, the response by the press is to sort of focus only on individual millennials that have made it and gotten super famous, gotten super rich, and sort of placing all of their bets on those particular individuals.
Right.
So those that you speak of in particular, one that comes up quite a bit, which you're more than welcome to go into because I think this is fascinating as well. You talk a lot about how LeBron James comes to symbolize certain aspects of neoliberalism as the sort of millennial hero.
Right.
And you also talk quite a bit, which gives us an avenue into thinking about feminism. You talk a lot about Aziz Ansari, although I think when you wrote this, it was certainly before the recent controversy about him.
Right.
But it's a precursor. And you also talk a lot about Drake. So if you could discuss a little bit more this idea of the sports figure, the rapper, and the sort of, I don't know, safe, quasi-feminist dude. I don't know what we would even call Aziz Ansari at this point, but other
than a creep. I mean,
right,
the guy,
yeah.
even before all this stuff came out, they had him on in some interview or another where he was sticking up for Louis C.K., who even himself stepped down and apologized and said, I behaved in really, really terrible ways as a guy in 1980, and I think Ansari sort of went behind him and apologized, or was an apologist for him. The significance of LeBron in some ways is almost, it's like extremely on the nose, to the point where if you just sort of look back on the details, it's like my job as a cultural historian is to sort of try to make certain things that seemed really, really innocuous, like a little bit more obvious. And in LeBron's case, it was actually that was a pretty easy project just because of where he came from, like this middle America town in Ohio, and the fact that recession and the specter of recession and the specter of the neoliberal turn in one facet or another just shadowed his career from the beginning. Mm-hmm. It's like impossible to talk about him as a basketball player without talking about him in connection to this particular region that has come to symbolize a lot of the failures of capitalism. And so he also, I think, represented, and so at the same time that he encapsulated that sort of narrative stew, there are a lot of ways in which attitudes about millennials as people who are always looking for a handout or looking for the easy way out, who don't have, who are very narcissistic and don't have an understanding of what it means to have a work ethic. All of these sort of general attitudes that have been levied onto millennials as we started to age in the 2000s, you really see those come to the forefront in criticisms that people have about LeBron James's career. So at one point in time, I think it's in section 9C of the book, like I just kind of just try to get down to basics and talk about, this is what this is really about. Like this conversation about LeBron James and people talking about him being, somebody who doesn't have much of a work ethic and somebody who's a whiner is really a function of attitudes about how to apportion resources under neoliberalism. And that discussion is also a general function of a conversation about the attitude that the state is supposed to have to American minorities vis-a-vis austerity measures, and that we got to a certain point collectively where we just decided if you're not able to make it on your own, that there must be something individually wrong with you. And so anytime anybody is sort of doing anything that seems like a cry for help or seems like I need some support here in achieving what I'm doing, it could be somebody talking about the social safety net not being present, or it could be LeBron saying, maybe I can't win as the only superstar on my team, or as the only, for a lot of those years, like kind of the only A-list basketball player on my team. I need a little bit of help with this. A lot of the same kinds of attitudes get rehearsed for both of those scenarios. And so sports becomes kind of this arena where people are able to polish racial and economic attitudes that in any other context would appear as transparently insensitive, transparently cruel, but because they happen, or because they're exercised in the direction of sport and competition, they're given much more of a pass, or they're seen just as opinions rather than as ideology, which is what I think they are. With respect to Drake and Aziz Ansari, what sort of starts to happen in chapter 10, I think, is I try to think a little bit about ways that male feelings and male sensitivity and a general sense of a softer, kinder, gentler male really just becomes the avenue for reinforcing male supremacy of one kind or another. And suddenly, in much the same way that I think many white people learn to put forward their feelings as an avenue to re-intensify a racial status quo or a racial hierarchy, men like, and I want to differentiate between Drake's music and who he is as a person. Like some of the sentiments that you get through his music are what a buddy of mine over drinks once called yet more dick-centered sensitivity, right? It's sensitivity, but it's all going still in the direction of trying to place the male at the center and male dominance at the center of any social interaction. And so having somebody who's a little bit more receptive to an idea of intersectionality or having a guy know what emotional labor means does not necessarily mean that they're going to be in a position to actually implement those in any way that actually does anything to dismantle patriarchy. And so that's kind of the just where, chapter 10 in talking about millennial men and millennial manhood goes, is just begging authors or begging readers and begging the question of, what are we doing in our personal lives to use feeling and sentiment to sort of reinforce sort of these hard-edged structures that are as old at this point as humankind.
So I think your comments here are apt, especially in thinking about the fact that, there is sort of this turn I've seen where people are embracing the language of feminism or the language of anti-racism, but there isn't necessarily a full embrace and practice of the act of being feminist or the act of being anti-racist. A lot of it's just a performance more so than an actual complete understanding of what actually needs to be done in the process of undoing some of these barriers that women and people of color face in our society. I think this part of the book is also really interesting, the fact that you decide to jump into these waters of feminism. You lean pretty heavily on authors like Andy Zeisler, who's been very critical of what she calls, quote unquote, marketplace feminism, or the use and co-optation of feminist ideology by neoliberalism to make it sort of this repackaged, consumable idea more than an ideology and way of life. If you could talk a bit about that. And then I'd also like to hear more from you about Hillary Clinton and some of the popular, at least nominal feminists that embraced her during election 2016.
Right. And, this is, I think, some of the territory where I have the least amount of embodied perspective. And so I think making sure to do sort of my due diligence as somebody who has an intuitive sense of just the general ways in which the rhetoric of marginalized populations is sort of used to pivot into actually pretty retrograde measures. It was really important to me to sort of go out and to augment that sense with people who have actually done a lot of the work. And so Andy Zeisler's book, We Were Feminists Once, was hugely influential for me in this regard. More broadly, I think Kimberly Crenshaw's writing about intersectionality is sort of a shadow over this entire chapter. And so it was sort of through and also I think about Arlie Hochschild's work in the earlier 1980s, in particular her book, The Managed Heart, where she coins the term emotional labor, which I'm sure had been pointed towards by scholars of color and women of color before then. She sort of puts it in a single volume sort of sense in this book in The Managed Heart. And so it was sort of through doing that research and sitting and living with the subject matter that I sort of started to arrive at more of an internalized sense where it was not necessarily there naturally, because it is not an embodied experience that I inhabit in much the same way that I think I'm able to talk a lot more naturally about race in the United States, or the social position of somebody like LeBron James. I think there's avenue to relate experientially in ways that there were less of when talking about the sort of women in the context of American neoliberalism. All of that said, I don't say any of that to be an apologia, right? I mean it to say it's really a situation where I think, in much the same way that you can have sort of the rhetoric of the Black Power struggle get upcycled and reappropriated in ways that actually despoil Black life in some pretty terrible ways. It's also true that feminism as a cultural movement, one of the things that you lose when it becomes a cultural movement is some of that political gust. And so people think of it as something more that feminism more as something that you can buy, or some words that you can use, or sort of a way that you can comport yourself on social media, as opposed to a way of thinking about emotional labor, maybe ways of putting in a little bit extra, even a little bit of extra work in your interpersonal relationships to downwardly redistribute emotional capital that you might have as a man or as an able-bodied person. And so that's sort of where, and so that's kind of the general framework for Chapter 11, Millennial Woman, right? And then it's also trying to think about ways that popular culture calls attention to that condition, right? Thinking about pop music as praxis, right? The music of somebody like Solange, or the music of somebody like Cardi B, the poetry of somebody like Jenny Zhang, people that are women and that are sort of in the public eye that are doing a lot to indicate that women are in just as much in need of care as women are used to throwing in the direction of men. Mm-hmm. And that also women are exhausted under neoliberalism, and because of it, as a result of having to expend certain kinds of emotional energy at work, and then actually do similar kinds of work at home. There's a great book that came out by Moira Weigel called Labor of Love. I think it's the subtitle's like The Invention of Modern Dating, where she like goes through and actually compares the experience of modern dating, and saying it's really not all that different from sort of the act of going on LinkedIn and trying to find professional connections, and that dating for many millennial women is kind of like a similar kind of requires a similar level of emotional labor as being an unpaid intern in the gig economy might. And so all of these kinds of ways that, you know, sort of the using the concept of emotional labor as sort of an avenue to talk about who tends to have to put in more kinds of care labor, and when that burden is put in, who is more disadvantaged as a result of labor becoming sort of emotional labor becoming a transactional piece. Like, what impact does that have on the mental health, material conditions, et cetera, of American women? And what does it look like when you have a generation of women who's really not known anything but that?
So really quickly on that note, there was one part of the book where you talk about Ali Wong, who's a comedian, and she had I think she was on a TV show in the past, and then she recently did a comedy special for Netflix called Baby Cobra or something, correct?
Right.
Which I actually I saw a few years ago, and I don't remember much of it, but you talk a bit about how she has this sort of vulgar humor, and you align her humor with a lot of the criticism that people like Ariel Levy makes in her book, Female Chauvinist Pigs. You note in particular that Ali says she wants to lie down, not lean in. Which obviously, I mean, she's making a joke on Sheryl Sandberg's work, which has been panned pretty broadly by leftists and people who see it as sort of a neoliberal mantra for feminism.
Right.
But I thought this was interesting because, especially with all of this talk about how women have second, third, and fourth shifts, and then emotional labor and all these things on top of the general labor that we're performing now, that we are very, closely linked to the workforce, the formal workforce, I should say, not the informal. It's just fascinating because I'm like, I'm kind of with her. I'm like, I want to lie down.
Right.
I do want to take a break. I think that I didn't read her line so much as a critique of what Sheryl Sandberg is saying, so much as it is like, we are tired though, right? Like there is a degree at which you have to say, there's a point where you have to say, enough is enough. I need to relax. I need to have someone take care of me. I need to have someone do this labor for me. And she's pregnant during the sketches itself, or the comedy special itself. So it sort of makes it even more perfect that she's like, I just want to lie down. So.
Yeah, no. And it's not the first time that, an obtuse guy sort of missed the joke and missed what was really being called attention to there. And that's actually up until right now, I had not seen sort of that internal contradiction between the way that I sort of deal with Baby Cobra as a special and sort of earlier points that are being made about sort of the disproportionate, like what happens when people are expending more care labor than they're receiving.
Mm-hmm.
It's just going to lead to fatigue. And so that's point taken. I think when Zero Books comes to me and says, your book is sold really well, it's time to do a second edition of this thing, that might be the first section that I go back in and try to do some rethinking about. So point well taken.
I mean, it was sort of, I saw it as almost like so with all this talk about UBI, right? I think the idea of women's additional layers of labor in addition to their, 9 to 5s or 8 to 6s or whatever they are.
Right.
It's almost like a moment of asking for rest as that UBI,
Right.
For those who don't know what I'm talking about, universal basic income, right? This sort of guaranteed financial safety net. I think for some women, myself included, sometimes we just want like an emotional safety net of just being able to relax and like not have to take care of everyone else. But yeah, I think this section about feminism is really interesting, and just like women's position in connection to neoliberalism and the ways that some women, especially some of the singers you mentioned, like Beyonce, like Cardi B, like Rihanna, like Nicki Minaj, all of whom sort of take center stage in this later chapter. It's really fascinating when you compare and contrast what their sort of social and political project is, even though it's often dismissed. The way that you sort of talk about that in contrast to people like Lena Dunham, who I would love to get your opinions on. You talk a bit about her in the book, but thinking a lot about, again, 2016 with Clinton and sort of what we were told about her as a feminist icon by these other women who fashioned themselves or have been fashioned by society as feminist icons. Where do they fit into this larger discussion, not only of millennialism, if you will, and the millennial historical moment, but also neoliberalism?
We should be in a situation where we're critical of any kind of market solution to a public problem. I think we've seen enough of it. We've seen quite a lot of it. If you have to, nonetheless, we live in a capitalist context. And I think while we're still patronizing this context, while some of us are thinking about patronizing and matronizing it, and others of us are thinking of ways to dismantle it, even as we're stuck in the middle of it, sort of the best that we can do while we're consuming its symbols and consuming its spectacles, I think, is looking at popular cultural representatives that beg social questions and that beg a context or a set of solutions outside of the market-oriented, and start to enter into the social and enter into the political. Pop culture representations that take it right up to that line where it suddenly becomes clear that we're not going to get all of our answers in and as a result of popular culture, but that some real kind of mobilization and hard questions outside of this sort of cultural sphere are going to be required, is something that we should move in the direction of. And so I look at Black female popular, sort of paragons of popular music as examples of this gust that Andy Ziesler actually talks about a little bit in her book, right? That at a certain point in time, the signs and symbols of popular culture, they're just really not going to be enough. But while we're here, women like Cardi B, who, at one point in time was a sex worker and is very, very open about sort of everything that she's gone through individually, socially, it begs the question of the positionality of why is it that people have to go through this, number one. And number two, for people that are in similar straits and for people who have to make similar hard kinds of decisions, it's tremendously reaffirming and is itself a kind of care labor, I think, that people are not accustomed to receiving in their private lives. And so for many people who might not have the same embodied experience as somebody like Cardi B, or for somebody who thinks that Rihanna appears unprofessional, or somebody who doesn't understand why Beyonce is so mad all the time and, making visual quotations to the Black Panthers at the halftime show of Super Bowl 50, people need to get, there's a lot of comforting and coddling that I think we're sort of accustomed to receiving in the representations that we patronize, and that one of the reasons why these representatives of popular culture are so are elevated as much and venerated as much by their fan bases as they are is not for cultural reasons as much as it is for political reasons. We don't see many Black women who are able to speak openly about surviving domestic abuse. We don't see that many Black women talking about explicitly what it's like to be dependent on antidepressants, like the general riff that we were talking about with Ali Wong of just being tired. It's not something that we see represented a lot, and so it becomes a lot of these popular culture figures start to assume an importance that is really not merely cultural, but becomes political in ways that I think are actually pretty useful for asking larger questions about capital as is.
Right. And I think that your discussion as well about, within the book at least, with regard to the place of identity as we move forward in politics is really important. So obviously we just talked about, Black women and their relationship with some of these questions of life under capitalism and life under neoliberalism in particular. I wonder then, and this is my final question, although I have many more to ask that I may have to just ask you off air one day.
Awesome.
But one of the things that I thought was interesting is, in this last chapter, I should say, you talk a lot about election 2016. And I noticed that Bernie is not super present in this discussion. You talk more about Clinton and Trump in the general election, although you do admit that you yourself canvassed for Bernie. And like, I admit that I voted for Bernie, and I also, did some phone banking and things like that. But right. I saw him during the primaries, at least, as a lesser evil, but already a lesser evil because I see myself as pretty far to the left of him. Right. And I'm wondering then, what do you see happening for 2020? Some people have mentioned that Bernie is most likely going to run again. And at the same time, while we're hearing these sort of whispers of him perhaps running again, I'm seeing some people ramp up with their no discussions of identity. This is only about class, sort of this class reductionist take. Right. That is really surprising considering some of the unforced errors that he made in 2016. So I'd be curious to know what you think about the election space going forward and where you see millennials, particularly considering their rather disproportionate support of Bernie Sanders. Right. What do you see happening going forward with this?
It's pretty wild. I mean, I think about the fact that at one point in time, Bernie had a tour of Southern colleges. He had a tour of like 7 Southern historically Black colleges and universities that he just like canceled at one point. Then obviously the optics of Marissa interrupting him, the optics of Marissa protesting during his speech, and then just the fact that he was not, I think, as forthcoming, and the language, I think, and the linguistic register that I think liberals are more adept at co-opting in regards to racial justice, did not come so naturally to him as a candidate. And so what you sort of look for is you hope that if you're on the actual left, not the nominal left, you hope for a number of things, right? You hope that these reports that we're seeing about Democrats spending more money in 2018, not just 2020, but 2018 as well, spending a ton of money in some areas, spending more money to defeat challengers from the left than they are to defeat challengers to the right. You hope that that's an unsuccessful project, number one. And number two, I guess more idealistically, you sort of hope that there were some internalized lessons that while we're stuck en masse with the Democrats and those of us who are in DSA are building a social alternative, a socialist alternative that is going to be able to address our condition from the left, while Democrats en masse are sort of generally a repository for a lot of left energy, you hope that there were some lessons learned about why 2016 ended in a spectacular failure. And I guess it kind of just goes to the larger point that if anybody thinks that the reason why Democrats lost was because they spent too much time talking about police reform, they spent too much time talking about, differently gendered folks or the disabled, or they spent too much time talking about identity, I think that, a person who would have that line of thinking is really going to be in for a rude awakening when you just, take a look at even a nominal glance at how the Democratic Party historically has survived, which is exactly as a repository for the needs and addressing the concerns of the subaltern, to put it one way. And I guess I kind of hope, I look at, I sort of see Kamala Harris and Cory Booker sort of sitting out there, and I sort of just sort of loathe the idea that somebody like Cory Booker in particular
Right.
is going to be able to occupy any kind of left space with any kind of credibility. But, I think a lot of times on the left, because things are so obvious to us and so clear and so formed in, years and years and hours of study and internalized parsing over our ideas, specifically POC leftist, it seems so obvious to us that this guy is a ruse.
Right.
But I think we underestimate the extent to which the optics and a little bit of rhetoric goes towards making somebody who is a suit appear like a man of the people. And I think that's what we're going to kind of decide in 2020. And the run up to 2018, I think, is going to be a real indicator for a lot of that. But I just can't talk about how happy I would be to see Cory Booker take an L, especially as somebody who has like still a little bit of a romantic connection, not to the Obama administration, but to the Obama campaigns and what those represented in the way of a promise. Even if it was very much a dream deferred, I think all of that rhetoric and all of those symbols of, we can sort of do this if we summon the political will, I think is important. And I think about a quote that Hegel had, or that Marx had about Hegel, where he sort of said that, all great historical events appear twice, right? The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. I think the Obama years were definitely a tragedy, and I'm not looking forward to the farce of a Cory Booker presidency, if that's what comes to pass in 2020.
Mm-hmm. I totally lied, by the way. I have one more question. This is usually what happens.
Of course.
I do have one more question, and it's based a bit on what you said here, but also what you've said in not only your book, but I believe in the article that you wrote as well, in defense of call-out culture. One of the things that you've mentioned is the fact that, if we are going to sort of pitch leftism to a specific group, why is our focus on that of those who are antagonizing the group that's already the base, right? So I think that there was a discussion that you've had, or that you've, an issue that you've raised about sometimes some people seeming not to recognize that the people who are already voting Democrat, who already have a really strong left history, ideologically speaking at least, and just obviously based on their everyday circumstances, are people of color, women, LGBTQ identified folks. Like, there are groups that are just sitting there waiting to vote, and that are often disenfranchised. And instead of gearing our focus there, there's this disproportionate focus sometimes on people who, and I'm not saying just white poor people or working class white people. I'm thinking specifically about racist white people, that some people who are self-proclaimed leftists seem to be gearing all of their attention toward. And I'm just trying to figure, you've talked about it. Can you explain a little bit more about your opinion on that? And then the final question is, where you think the left itself is going, if it's going to actually succeed in 2020 and beyond that, beyond the electoral sphere as well.
Right. I mean, I think a lot we get all kinds of narratives about what it means to be an empathic individual in society. And I think that sort of pursuant to this idea of emotional labor, a lot of that tends to be expended by people who are disadvantaged in the direction of trying to forgive or cater to or appeal to people that really don't want to have anything to do with any kind of reconciliation at all. Mm-hmm. And it's a wasted effort. It's wasted political capital and political energy. I think about a book that an Obama campaign operative named Steve Phillips wrote called Brown is the New White, where he sort of explained that one of the advents of, again, the Obama elections, not necessarily the administrations, but the Obama elections as a set of coalitions between progressive whites who by and large get it, people of color, sexual minorities and others, that really, if you just spent most of your time sort of investing political capital and energy and getting that base to turn out and be excited about even merely social democratic reforms, we wouldn't necessarily have the need to be appealing to or pivoting to the center. But whiteness rears its head historically in very ugly ways, and it is also something that I think a lot of members of the left have exonerated themselves the responsibility of critiquing under the guise of being Marxists and socialists who put economics first. It actually is kind of another way of writing a bit of a moral blank check to be invisible, or rendering invisible and not having much analysis about populations that capitalism has disproportionately despoiled. And so that's a real problem. Do I pretend to be the person who's going to think about how to bring a lot of leftists who fall into that category to Jesus and thinking about, hey guys, here's how you're going to have to, I really don't know what that looks like. I think for me, building a kind of solidarity with people who already get it and with people who need the most help is really the direction that we need to be sort of going in. And we're actually going to be rewarded electorally for doing that, because in this book, Brown is the New White, right? The guy makes the case, like, there are upwards of 4 or 5 of age people who are not registered to vote in the state of Texas, but presidential elections there are decided by less than 1 million votes routinely, so that if you turned out even half of that block or even a quarter of that block, what we think of as a deep red state would suddenly become blue. I think the problem is that the Democratic Party is an institution. I'm not talking about individual Democrats who might have good hearts and might even be in DSA. The Democratic Party as an institution doesn't want to make the kinds of promises in those areas that will enable them to win, because it's going to require them to pivot away from a kind of corporate politics. It's going to require them to make promises like Medicare for all. And that's going to be, that's just frankly something that a lot of Democrats really don't want to do. So it's not a question of Democrats being completely inept, or actually it is a problem about Democrats being completely inept, but I think it's also the question of, do they actually want to win on these terms, or are they more content to lose their way?
Right. Well,
and yeah,
we'll see. We shall see.
That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, Shaun, this is great. Thank you so much for your thoughts. And I hope that everyone who gets a chance to definitely reads your book very soon. It's coming out, as I said, today, Friday the 23rd. The full title of the book is Millennials and the Moments That Made Us, A Cultural History of the U.S. from 1982 to the Present. So make sure you cop that. And thanks so much again, Shaun, for being with me.
All right. Thank you.
And thank you for listening to the Left Pocket Project podcast. Before I go, I wanted to include one more nice comment from someone who wrote about the Left Pocket Project online. She said, quote, "Honestly, if you're a podcast person and you're not listening to Left POC, you're screwing up, y'all." And I would have to say that I wholeheartedly agree. Whether or not you're a podcast person, however, remember that the Left Pocket Project is more than just a podcast. If you follow Left POC on social media, you already know this backstory, but here it is again just in case. I began the project in 2016 as the hashtag LeftPOC, which I started in response to people with large platforms ignoring or intentionally erasing the history of leftists of color who led and comprised leftist movements in the United States and around the world. Through the hashtag, I posted hundreds of books about Left POC so people could learn more, but later expanded the hashtag into an interactive educational project, better known as the Left Pocket Project. In addition to the work I do with the Central Podcast, I also run all the social media accounts where I post articles, books, and interviews about Left POC throughout history and in the present, in addition to featuring a Left POC of the Week, in which I spotlight one person or group's involvement in leftist movements. And now, I've joined forces with Richard, aka Progressive Green, on Twitter, to bring you Reading Revolution, a new series of the podcast in which he and I discuss the work written by Left POC and the thinkers who inspired them. Be on the lookout soon for the first episode, in which we will discuss Fidel Castro's 1953 speech, History Will Absolve Me. Alright, so that's all for now. Be sure to follow and interact with the Left Pocket Project by searching for Left POC, and that's LEFTPOC, wherever you get your social media fix, and to listen, subscribe, rate, and review the Left Pocket Project podcast on Spreaker, SoundCloud, or iTunes. And finally, of course, to show your support on Patreon by going to patreon.com/leftpoc. Thanks so much again, and have a good one.